Dad won't pay my tuition, says I'd be competition for his golden child, but years later I am thriving and he want this. So, I'm 32 now, and I've got a younger brother who's 27. We were raised mostly by our mom because honestly, Dad was barely around when I was a kid. He was always off doing important stuff, which looking back was just him choosing work over family. I don't remember him being at home much, maybe on weekends here and there, but it's not like we ever did any father-son bonding or whatever. He missed out on all the little moments, you know? My first baseball game, school awards, even the time I ended up in the ER with a broken arm. Mom handled it all. By the time my brother came along, things changed. It was like Dad flipped some switch. Suddenly he was this hands-on, super involved dad, always around for my brother's school events, sports games, and even the random stuff like Cub Scouts meetings. The guy who barely had time to show up for me was suddenly the perfect dad for my brother. He'd do the whole big game talk thing, throw the football around in the backyard, give pep talks, and all the stuff I'd wished he'd done with me. Now I don't hold it against my brother. He didn't ask to be treated like the golden child, but I'm not going to lie. Watching it all happen kind of messed with my head. Here I was, this kid who'd always hoped for a little attention from Dad, and my brother just got it all without even trying. I mean, Dad acted like we were strangers half the time, but he'd light up around my brother like he was some mini version of himself. And it wasn't just me noticing it. Mom could tell too. She'd try to keep things balanced, never played favorites or anything like that. If anything, she made extra effort with me since she saw Dad was more focused on my brother. We'd spend time together reading, messing around in the kitchen, doing puzzles, just quiet stuff that wasn't flashy but meant a lot to me. She'd always tell me, "You don't have to be like your dad to be great," and that kept me going. I needed to hear it, especially when it felt like Dad was just disappointed in me for not being into guy stuff. Anyway, as I got older, I gave up trying to win Dad over. I tried to bond with him a few times, hoping he'd maybe take an interest in something I liked. But nope. He'd always look at me like he was confused by me, like I was some puzzle he couldn't solve. And eventually, I just stopped putting myself out there. Figured if he wanted a connection, he'd have to make an effort too. Spoiler, he never did. My brother, though, total opposite. He was every bit the son Dad wanted. Loved sports, wasn't afraid to get his hands dirty, even had the same stubborn attitude. I think Dad loved that he could see so much of himself in my brother. They'd spend hours together doing, well, whatever they did, fishing, camping, playing catch. Meanwhile, I'd be in my room, either reading or messing around on my computer. And that's how it was, them outside playing football, me inside with my books or whatever project I was working on. Dad would come inside, see me with my head buried in a book or tapping away on the keyboard, and he'd just shake his head. I could practically hear him thinking, why couldn't I have another son like my youngest? He never said it out loud, but he didn't have to. It was in every look, every sigh, every time he'd tell my brother he was proud of him but barely look my way. To be honest, I think part of him saw me as Mom's kid, while my brother was his. Maybe it's because Mom was the one who did everything for me. School events, ER visits, homework, you name it. When he was around, Dad would just do his own thing, occasionally stepping in for some fatherly advice that didn't mean much because, well, he didn't know me. Half the time, he didn't even try to understand me. And the other half? He was too busy with my brother to even notice I was around. When my brother got to the age where he was joining all these sports teams, it became like Dad's second job to coach him. They'd come home from games all hyped up, telling me about some amazing play my brother made or how he got player of the game. I'd sit there, listen politely, nodding along, and Dad would go on like I wasn't even part of the conversation. It's not like I expected a big pat on the back for just sitting there, but I mean, it would have been nice if he even asked what I was up to. Honestly, I'd always hoped that as I got older, things would change. That maybe Dad would come around and see that just because I wasn't like him didn't mean I was worthless. But no. He'd say things like, "A real man isn't afraid to get his hands dirty," or "Why don't you join a team or something?" I remember feeling this mix of frustration and disappointment, like I could never be enough for him just as I was. Meanwhile, Mom was the opposite. She'd ask me about the books I was reading, sit with me while I worked on random tech projects, and actually listen. She'd tell me she was proud of me, and that was all I needed to hear. Looking back, she was probably doing double duty trying to be both parents because she knew Dad wasn't going to step up. And she never once made me feel like I had to change or be manlier to be worth something. If it wasn't for her, I don't think I would have had the confidence to even go after my dreams later on. But here's the thing. When I lost her, everything fell apart. I was only 13, and suddenly the one person who actually got me was gone. After she passed, Dad seemed like he got even more into my brother's life, if that was even possible. They grew closer, and I just faded into the background. I tried to keep going, find some way to connect with him, but the more I tried, the more it felt like I was just a reminder of everything he didn't like. So yeah, growing up wasn't exactly easy, especially when I had to watch Dad and my brother have this tight bond that I never got to experience. I know some people might say, well, that's just how families are, parents have favorites. But until you're that kid on the outside looking in, you don't know what it's like to feel like you're second best in your own family. All I ever wanted was to be accepted by him, but that never happened. Now, my brother was too young to notice any of this when we were kids, and even now, I doubt he realizes how things played out. It's not his fault, and I don't hold it against him, but I can't forget it either. Losing Mom changed everything. I was 13, just barely a teenager, and I'd lost the one person who actually got me. It was like my whole world went dark. Without her, I felt adrift, like there was no one left in the house who saw me, let alone understood me. She'd been my only support, the only one who thought I had potential. And now, gone. After she passed, things around the house got way more intense. You'd think losing a parent would make everyone pull together, right? Like, we'd all start relying on each other to cope. But that didn't happen. Not even close. My dad and brother seemed to carry on as if nothing had changed, like we hadn't just lost the heart of the family. I was devastated, trying to process this huge loss, while they acted like everything was normal. If anything, my dad just seemed to lean even more into his relationship with my brother, leaving me in the dust. I remember coming home from school one day, maybe a few months after Mom passed. I'd had a rough day, kids giving condolences like it was the first time they'd heard, teachers giving me these pitying looks. All I wanted was to come home and feel like I wasn't alone. But when I walked in, there was my dad, watching TV with my brother, laughing about something like they didn't have a care in the world. I felt like a ghost in my own house. I started spending a lot more time in my room. Honestly, it just hurt too much to be around them. I'd be in the kitchen making myself a snack, and they'd stroll in, talking about my brother's latest football game or some other thing they'd done together. They'd barely look my way. It was like they didn't even notice I was standing there. I'd try to chime in sometimes, add to the conversation, but Dad would just give me this look that said, "Why are you interrupting?" I eventually just gave up. With Mom gone, I didn't even know who I was supposed to turn to. I needed support, someone to talk to about how hard things had gotten, but there was no one. Dad was too busy treating my brother like his little protege, and my brother, well, he was just a kid. He was wrapped up in his own life, probably not even realizing how different things were for me. So I threw myself into what I knew. Tech. Coding, to be specific. At first, it was just a distraction, a way to keep my mind off things. But the more I dove into it, the more I realized I was good at it. I'd spend hours teaching myself new things, working on projects, making websites from scratch. Every time I figured something out, I'd feel this little spark of satisfaction. It was something to hold on to, something that didn't depend on anyone else. And for a while, it was enough. But of course, Dad didn't see it that way. To him, I was just wasting my time on the computer. He'd make these snide comments whenever he saw me coding like, "When are you going to do something useful?" Or, "Real men don't hide behind a screen." I'd just nod and keep working. I'd learned by then that arguing with him was pointless. If he couldn't understand it, then it wasn't worth his attention. Then there was this one day that really sticks out. I'd been working on this project for weeks, building a small program that could help with basic tasks. Something simple but cool, especially for my age. I was excited, It was finally working, and I wanted to show someone. My first instinct was to tell my dad. Stupid as that sounds now. I guess I still wanted his approval, no matter how many times he'd ignored me. So I went up to him, showed him what I'd built, and explained how it worked, hoping he'd see how much effort I'd put in. But he just glanced at the screen, gave me this half-hearted, "That's nice," and went right back to whatever he was doing. That was the moment it hit me. No matter what I did, he was never going to care. He was too busy being my brother's biggest fan to even notice my achievements, let alone support them. From that point on, I stopped looking for his approval altogether. I kept my head down, did my own thing, and figured if he didn't care, then neither did I. I'd come home, go straight to my room, and work on my projects for hours. It was my escape, my way of finding some control in a world that felt upside down. And every time I'd learn something new or build something cool, it was like a little victory, even if no one else cared. I started saving up doing odd tech gigs here and there for people who needed help. Fixing computers, building simple websites, troubleshooting, whatever I could find to make a little cash. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep me going, enough to make me feel like I was actually getting somewhere. I didn't need Dad's approval or his praise. I was figuring things out on my own. Meanwhile, my brother was thriving under Dad's guidance. He was the star of the football team, always getting hyped up at family gatherings, while I'd get the usual, "Oh, and you're still doing that computer stuff?" I'd just nod, figuring there was no point in trying to make them understand. My brother got all the attention, all the pride from our dad, while I was left to figure things out on my own. And look, I know it sounds petty, but when you're that age, stuff like that matters. When your family doesn't seem to care about the things that make you who you are, it messes with you. It makes you wonder if maybe they're right, if maybe what you're doing really is a waste of time. But I pushed through, kept working on my tech stuff, because deep down I knew I had to prove it to myself that I was worth something, even if my dad couldn't see it. After a while, I got used to being on my own. It was just easier that way. Dad and my brother had their world, and I had mine. They were all about sports, socializing, going out to games, while I was in my room with my laptop, coding my heart out. And honestly, it wasn't so bad. I had my little victories, my sense of purpose, and that was enough. But I'd be lying if I said I didn't sometimes look out the window and see them tossing a football around in the yard, laughing like they didn't have a care in the world, and wonder why I couldn't be a part of that. Why I couldn't be the son my dad wanted. Why I couldn't fit into that picture. I guess that's just how it was, though. I had my path, they had theirs, and I was learning to live with it. As long as I had my tech, my projects, I felt like I was building something real, something that mattered, even if Dad would never understand it. By the time I was finishing high school, I knew what I wanted to do: tech. I'd been tinkering with coding for years, and it was finally starting to pay off. I had a few small projects under my belt, a little online portfolio, and I was ready to make a career out of it. Going to college for computer science was a no-brainer for me. I didn't see any other way forward, so I started applying. I didn't aim small either. I went for the big schools with solid tech programs, the kind that would open doors and get me where I wanted to be. I even lined up a summer internship at a local tech startup to get some real experience. For once, I felt like I was on a path that actually meant something, something that was mine. But here's where things got messy. My dad, who hadn't shown much interest in my tech journey, didn't exactly jump at the chance to support me. I knew college would be expensive, especially for the schools I'd gotten into, and while I had some scholarships lined up, I still needed help with tuition. So I did what anyone in my position would do. I sat him down and laid it all out. I told him about my goals, about how tech wasn't just some hobby anymore, but my future. He listened, but I could tell he was barely absorbing any of it. When I was done, he just sighed and said, "Look, I don't think it's worth spending all that money on something so unpredictable." He threw in a line about real jobs and something about stability, and all I could do was sit there, stunned. I mean, this was coming from the guy who could drop money on sports gear for my brother without blinking. My brother got all the financial backing he needed for his stuff, the games, the travel, the training sessions. But when it came to my education, my future, suddenly, it was too big of an investment. I tried explaining how this wasn't just some shot in the dark. I had a plan, and I was willing to put in the work. I even showed him my scholarship letters and talked about the internship I'd secured, but he just shook his head, acting like I was some clueless kid chasing a fantasy. He goes, "Your brother is struggling with his grades, and he needs our support right now. You can figure this out on your own." That line hit me harder than I'd like to admit. It was like everything I'd worked for, everything I was trying to build, was just invisible to him. It was clear that he wasn't going to help, no matter how much I tried to reason with him. The money wasn't even the main issue, I think. It was just that he didn't see tech as something real, something worth investing in. After that conversation, I packed up my stuff, left the house, and went straight to my aunt's place. My aunt, my mom's older sister, had always been there in the background, and she was the one person I felt I could turn to. She didn't have a fancy house or a ton of money, but she listened. I told her everything, the whole mess with my dad, and she didn't hesitate to offer me a place to stay. Moving in with her wasn't easy, though. Her house was smaller, and it was in a completely different part of town. I had to switch schools, leave behind what few friends I'd managed to keep, and start over. But it was the only choice I had. I couldn't keep living in a place where I felt like an outsider in my own family. When I told her about my college plans, she did something that completely shocked me. She offered to help cover my tuition. Now, she didn't have much money. She was living paycheck to paycheck herself, but she said she'd figure something out. She even went so far as to ask a few of her close friends for support. They chipped in too, and somehow, they made it happen. It wasn't a full ride, but it was enough to get me started. I remember that moment clearly. sitting in her small, cluttered kitchen, going over the finances, looking at the checks her friends had written out for me. It was one of the most humbling experiences of my life. These were people who barely knew me, but they believed in me more than my own father did. I promised myself right then and there that I'd make every dollar count, that I wouldn't let their faith in me go to waste. So, I enrolled in college, focusing on computer science. It was surreal, finally getting to study what I loved. I kept my head down, worked hard, and picked up as many skills as I could. The professors were top-notch, the environment was inspiring, and I felt like I was finally where I was meant to be. For the first time, I didn't feel like I was running uphill just to prove myself. During college, I also started working on some side projects. I'd been sitting on an idea for a while, something I thought could really make a difference in the tech space. Between classes, assignments, and part-time gigs, I'd chip away at this project, pouring every spare minute I had into it. It wasn't easy. Balancing everything was exhausting, but I was determined to make it work. Looking back, that period of my life was the turning point. Every late night, every weekend spent coding instead of going out, every dollar I scraped together, it was all building towards something bigger. And through it all, my aunt was there, cheering me on, even if she didn't fully understand what I was doing. She'd ask questions, genuinely interested, even if the tech jargon went over her head. Just knowing she was in my corner kept me going. I'd like to say that this whole experience made me stronger, and maybe it did, but it also left a mark. I stopped expecting anything from my dad or my brother. I realized they'd never be the kind of family that would support me, at least not in the way I needed. That hurt, and yeah, it made me angry, but it also pushed me to prove that I didn't need their approval to make something of myself. Over time, I saved up enough from freelancing and side gigs to pay my aunt back a bit. I'd slip her an envelope every month with what I could afford, and she'd always protest, saying it wasn't necessary, that she was just happy to see me thriving. But I insisted. She'd given me a shot when no one else would, and I couldn't just let that go. By the time I was getting close to graduation, I had a working prototype for my app. I didn't tell anyone about it, mostly because I didn't want to get my hopes up. But I poured everything I had into it, hoping maybe, just maybe, it would be the thing to set me apart, to prove to myself, and maybe even to my dad, though he'd never know, that I was worth betting on. That was my life for those years. College, coding, and trying to scrape by on what little I had. It wasn't easy, but I wouldn't trade it for anything. Every step I took, every hurdle I cleared, brought me closer to becoming someone I was proud of, even if the people who were supposed to care the most couldn't see it. Looking back, it's almost funny how things turned out. The guy who was told his dreams were a waste of time, who got tossed aside by his own father, ended up carving his own path. It wasn't thanks to my family, but in spite of them. And somehow that made it all the more satisfying. Graduation came and went in a blur. All those years of hard work, the late nights and all-nighters finally paid off. I felt like I'd come a long way from the kid hiding in his room to avoid his own family. By then, my app was fully built, polished, and actually working well. I still hadn't told anyone in my family about it, except my aunt. She didn't fully understand what I'd created, but she was thrilled for me anyway. That kind of support, even if it was just her saying, "I'm proud of you," meant a lot. Once I graduated, I decided to go all in on my app. It was a gamble, and I knew it could go either way, but I felt like I finally had something that could make an impact. I was a nobody in the industry, but I'd already put in so much work I figured there was no harm in taking it to the next level. If it failed, well, I'd find a way to pick myself up. If it succeeded, well, I didn't even know what that would look like yet, but I was ready to find out. I started off small, pitching my app to a few local companies. Most of them didn't bite, and I can't even tell you how many rejections I got. But I kept pushing, improving things bit by bit, and learning from the feedback, even when it was brutal. That persistence started paying off in ways I didn't expect. A few people gave it a shot, and they liked it. Word spread slowly, and before I knew it, people were reaching out to me. There was this one moment, though, that stands out more than any of the initial successes. I was working late one night, completely absorbed, when my phone buzzed. It was an email from a bigger tech company, not massive, but definitely big enough that they could give me a serious boost if they were interested. I must have read that email 100 times, making sure I wasn't imagining things. They wanted a meeting, and they wanted it soon. I remember sitting in my little apartment, staring at the screen and feeling like, finally, things were turning in my favor. All those years of hearing tech isn't a real career or it's just a hobby were coming back to me. But this time, they didn't sting. I realized I didn't need anyone's approval anymore. I was doing this for myself, and it was working. I went to that meeting more nervous than I'd like to admit. I'd never pitched anything to a company this big before. I showed them what my app could do, explained how it solved a few key problems they'd been struggling with, and did my best to hide my nerves. When the guy running the meeting leaned back, looked at me and said, "I think we can work something out," I had to stop myself from grinning like an idiot. That deal became my first big break. It wasn't some millionaire maker overnight or anything, but it was enough to give me credibility, enough to get my app in front of more people. From there, things took off faster than I'd ever expected. Other companies started reaching out, and suddenly, I was juggling more projects than I knew what to do with. And then, the money started coming in. Not crazy money at first, but enough to pay off some of my student loans, help my aunt with her bills, and finally get a decent place to live. I moved out of my cramped apartment into something that didn't feel like I was constantly dodging leaky pipes and broken windows. It was the first time in my life I actually felt stable, like I was building something that would last. I wish I could say I was content with that I just kept my head down and focused on work, but honestly, a part of me wanted to show my dad and brother what I'd accomplished. I hadn't spoken to either of them since I'd left home, and as far as I knew, they hadn't tried to reach out either. I knew it was petty, but I wanted them to know I'd made something of myself, that their lack of support hadn't held me back. Still, I kept my distance. I was afraid that if I did reach out, they'd somehow twist it around, make it seem like I owed them something, or worse, downplay what I'd done. I wasn't going to give them that chance. I focused on work, built up my client list, and kept pushing my app to the next level. I made a few smart moves with my savings, investing in some equipment and hiring a couple of freelancers to help expand the app's capabilities. It was a leap of faith, but by then, I'd learned to trust my instincts. The investment paid off, and pretty soon, I was making more than I'd ever thought possible. I remember the day I hit my first real milestone. I just signed a major deal with a company that wanted to incorporate my app into their own systems. This deal was big enough to put me on the map, to give me a kind of credibility I'd only dreamed about. I wanted to celebrate, but I didn't really have anyone to celebrate with. My friends from college had scattered, and I was pretty much a lone wolf. My aunt was thrilled when I told her, though. She even threw a little get-together with a couple of her friends who'd pitched in to help me get through school. I guess what I really wanted was for someone in my family, besides my aunt, to care, to acknowledge that I'd done something meaningful. But deep down, I knew it was never going to happen. I'd proven to myself that I could succeed without them, but it still hurt that they'd never see the side of me that was finally thriving. Over the next few months, things kept growing. My app gained traction, and I found myself in a position I'd never expected, financially stable, with options to expand and invest in new projects. It was surreal, going from being the kid who wasn't good enough to someone who could actually make a difference. I didn't need validation anymore, but that didn't mean the past hadn't left scars. I still felt like the outsider, the one they'd written off. But despite all that, I felt a weird sense of peace. I'd built something from the ground up, without my dad's approval or my brother's acceptance. I'd found my own path, created my own success, and if they didn't care, well, that was on them, not me. That chapter of my life was closing, and I was finally okay with it. After all the work I'd put into getting where I was finally feeling settled. The app was doing great, and I had my own place, a nice setup, and enough success that I didn't have to worry about things like bills or security. It was a good feeling, one I'd never really known before. My life was finally on track, and for once, I didn't feel like I had anything to prove to anyone. So imagine my surprise when, one evening, my dad and brother showed up at my office. No warning, no heads up, just them standing there at my door like they'd been invited. I'd been working late, and when I heard a knock, I figured it was one of my employees or maybe even the cleaning crew. I opened the door, and there they were, my dad, looking a little sheepish, and my brother, trying to play it cool, but looking just as uncomfortable. I just stared at them, kind of stunned. It was like seeing ghosts. I mean, after all these years with no calls, no messages, nothing. And here they were, standing in my office like it was the most normal thing in the world. For a second, I thought maybe I was dreaming. I didn't even know what to say, and they just stood there, waiting for me to invite them in. Eventually, I stepped aside and let them in, mostly out of shock. They walked in and looked around, taking in the space like they were trying to size up what I'd accomplished. My office wasn't huge, but it was nice. I'd made it that way with my own money and hard work. There was a small lounge area where I usually met with clients, and they sat down there, looking all awkward and out of place. After a few seconds of silence, my dad cleared his throat and said, "We heard about your success. Figured it was time we stopped by and checked in." He tried to smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. I could tell he was uncomfortable, maybe even a little intimidated. My brother, on the other hand, looked like he was barely holding it together. I could see it in his face. He wasn't exactly thrilled to be there. I wasn't sure how to respond, so I just nodded and sat down across from them, trying to keep my face neutral. I felt a weird mix of emotions, anger, confusion, maybe even a little bit of satisfaction seeing them here, finally acknowledging what I'd done. But I kept it cool and just waited for them to say whatever they'd come to say. My dad started off with some small talk, asking about the app and how the business was going. It was weird, hearing him act interested, like he'd always been supportive. I answered his questions with short, polite responses, not giving him much to work with. I could see he was struggling to keep the conversation going, and that gave me a small, petty sense of satisfaction. After all the years of him dismissing me, here he was, trying to play the proud dad, and it just didn't sit right. Finally, after a few minutes of this awkward back and forth, my brother jumped in. He didn't bother with the small talk. "Look, we need your help," he said, cutting right to the chase. My dad shot him a look, probably annoyed that he'd been so blunt, but I was glad he'd said it. At least now we were getting to the real reason they were here. I raised an eyebrow, waiting for him to continue. He looked down, fiddling with his hands, and then started explaining. Apparently, things hadn't been going so great for him. His job wasn't paying much, and he was struggling to make ends meet. On top of that, he'd racked up some debt, and my dad had been helping him out for a while, but it had gotten to be too much. They were in a tight spot, and they'd come to me hoping I'd be able to lend a hand. I had to bite back a laugh. After all the years of being ignored and treated like an outsider, they were here asking for my help. I couldn't believe the audacity. I kept my face as blank as possible, though, and just listened while my dad tried to paint it like this was some kind of family crisis, and that it was my duty to step in. When he finished, I just sat there looking at them. They stared back, probably expecting me to say yes, to jump in and save the day. But I didn't. I leaned back, crossed my arms, and asked, "Why me? You guys haven't cared about me or my work for years. What makes you think I'd want to help now?" My dad shifted uncomfortably, trying to come up with a response. He started to say something about family sticking together and forgiveness, but I wasn't buying it. All those years of him putting my brother first, dismissing my interests, refusing to support my education, they were all flashing through my mind. I realized that they hadn't come because they wanted to make amends. They were here because they needed something. I told them as much, laying it all out in a calm, matter-of-fact way. I said, "You know, it's funny. When I was struggling, you guys were nowhere to be found. When I needed support, you both acted like I didn't matter. Now that I'm successful, suddenly you remember I exist. I'm not some backup plan you can come to when things get rough." My dad tried to interrupt, saying it wasn't like that they'd always cared, but maybe hadn't shown it well. My brother chimed in, talking about how hard things have been for him, but it all just sounded like excuses. I'd spent years dealing with their lack of support, and I wasn't about to let them guilt me into fixing their problems now. I told them, "I've worked too hard to get where I am, without any help from either of you. I don't owe you anything." The look on their faces was priceless. My dad looked like he'd been slapped, and my brother just stared at the floor, silent for once. I could see the realization setting in that I wasn't going to bail them out, that I'd moved on without them. They left not long after that, my dad muttering something about thinking it over and family loyalty. I just nodded and saw them to the door, keeping my distance. As they walked out, I felt this strange mix of emotions, a little bit of anger, a lot of relief, and surprisingly, peace. I'd spent so many years feeling like I had to prove myself to them, but now I realized I didn't need their approval or validation. I'd done it on my own, and that was enough. After they left, I sat in my office for a while just thinking. I knew they'd probably never reach out again, and I was fine with that. My life had moved on, and I didn't need them to be part of it. For the first time, I felt free. Free of their expectations, free of their judgment, and free to be exactly who I wanted to be. It wasn't the reunion I'd imagined, but it was exactly the closure I needed.